What do you know about your CO? Frankie asked. He's tough as nails. Doesn't talk much about himself. I hear he's engaged to some admiral's daughter. You probably know him better than we
Do?
No, Frankie said. I didn't really know him well. An admiral's
Daughter, huh?
engaged. It's hardly surprising.
Why?
Frankie almost said, look at him, but held her tongue. Even with Coyote's arms around her, slow dancing, Frankie found her gaze drawn again and again to Rye. She watched the way he laughed with his men, the way he stood apart from them sometimes. She could tell how much they respected him. Every glance took her back to Finley's going-away party, when she hadn't been able to look away, either, and their moment in her father's office. Women can be heroes. Those words, his words, to an impressionable 20-year-old had led her inevitably to this room, this war. It felt like fate, them meeting here. I have my own room, Frankie, Coyote said, nuzzling her neck as they
danced.
We could be alone. Coyote, she said quietly. He drew back, looked at her. You're right. I should ask you out for a real date. I want to do this right with you, Frankie.
The music changed.
There was a crash of furniture and a rise of laughter. At the edge of the dance floor, Barb had missed the chair and fallen to the floor. Frankie pulled out of Coyote's arms and went to her friend. Rye was there first, helping Barb to her feet. Barb threw her arms around Rye's neck and hung on. My bones melted, she said. Her head lolled back, and she grinned drunkenly at Frankie. Look at this one. Frankie. Frankie turned to Rye. The way he looked at her was unnerving.
Too
intense. It made her feel strange, fluttery. I should get her back to the caravel. I'll get an MP to drive you. Rye helped maneuver Barb out of the O Club and to an MP Jeep. Frankie climbed in beside her. Coyote came out of the O Club. Frankie, I'll come to see. Bye, Coyotes, Frankie said, waving as the Jeep took off. Back at the hotel, she helped Barb up the stairs and into their room. While Barb was peeing, she looked up, bleary-eyed, and said, Don't let me fall off the toilet. Balance is for shit. Whiskey, Frankie said, and they both laughed. Frankie helped Barb out of her clothes and into bed. Dia see the cat in the sunglasses? Barb said, flopping back into the clean white sheets. Good-looking man. I saw him, Frankie said, pulling the covers up to Barb's chin. With the lights out, and to the sound of Barb snoring, Frankie tried to sleep. It should have been easy. She had drunk plenty tonight, and there was no fear of a mortar attack or a maskell to waken her in the middle of the
night.
She was on clean, fresh sheets. Still, sleep eluded her. She felt restless, anxious. The phone rang. She answered before it wakened Barb. Hellos, Miss McGrath, said a Vietnamese man in French-accented English. There's a young man here to see you. He asks that you meet him at the top-floor bar.
Coyote.
Frankie didn't want to see him now, but she owed him the truth. He wasn't the man for her, and she couldn't sleep anyway. She threw back the covers and dressed in jeans and a t-shirt and went to the elevator, which was out of order. Sighing, she walked up 4 flights of stairs and emerged onto the hotel's dimly lit rooftop bar. A 3-piece band sent music out across an empty dance floor. She could see a small group of men and women huddled in one corner, all of them smoking and talking loudly, arguing. She could hear typewriters clacking. Journalists. She'd heard that this bar was one of their hangouts along with the bar at the Rex Hotel. She wondered what they were arguing about. If their perspectives on the war were as at odds as her own, if they were as divided as America seemed to be. Frankie walked over to a quiet table by a window and sat down. In the moonlight, the Continental Hotel across the street was dark except for a few illuminated rooms. She couldn't help thinking of Jamie, who long ago had told her about this romantic rooftop bar. Sadness tainted the memory, left a sharp little bite, and then softened into regret. She tried instead to imagine him at home with his family but couldn't quite manage that kind of optimism. A slim Vietnamese woman appeared quietly to take Frankie's drink. Order. Moments later, she returned with a glass of Sancerre. Frankie took a sip of the wine as she stared out at the night lights of
Saigon.
Even with music playing, the noise of the war was ever present. The whir of a helicopter flying over the city, the pop of gunfire. Here and there, streaks of red arced through the night sky like fireworks. Orange fires blossomed. From here, the war was almost beautiful. Maybe that was a fundamental truth. War looked one way for those who saw it from a safe
Distance.
close up, the view was different. Frankie,
Rye.
she looked up in surprise. The Vietnamese waitress glided effortlessly into place beside Rai.
Scotch.
Neat, Rai said. When the waitress left, Rai sat down opposite Frankie, saying nothing until he had his drink in front of him, and the waitress had gone. Seeing you was like going back in time.
Yeah.
Finley was the best friend I ever had. Me, too. He sat back, studied her.
So.
A combat nurse. I would have thought. You'd be married to a millionaire son by now. Some guy I met at a party told me that women could be heroes. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. I don't think you needed to hear it from me, he said, his gaze steady on hers. She couldn't help wondering what he saw when he looked at her. Finley's kid sister? Or did he see who she'd become? I did need to hear it, she said quietly. The music changed to something unrecognizable. He said, dance with me. As a girl, she dreamed about this moment with him. As a woman, she knew how fragile dreams were, and this war had taught her to dance while she could. She got to her feet. He took her hand in his and led her to the dance floor.
She fit up against
him, felt his arms encircle her. They moved in time to the music, but they weren't really dancing. She would have sworn she could feel his heart beating against hers. He looked down, and she saw desire in his eyes. No man had ever looked at her like this, as if he wanted to devour her, bones and all. When the song ended, she pulled free. We probably shouldn't dance, she said, feeling shaky. You're engaged, from what I hear. She's a long way away. Frankie managed to smile, but only barely. They were not the words she
wanted to hear from him.
I've already had my heart broken over here, she said quietly, taking another step back. And I expect an officer to be a gentleman, Rai. He locked his hands behind his back. Soldier's stance. A respectful
Distance.
Forgive me for coming here tonight. His voice had a rough edge
To it.
It wasn't my place. She nodded, tried again to smile. Stay alive, Rai. I'm seeing too many bird pilots in my oar. Goodbye, Frankie. Goodbye. Frankie tossed and turned all night, her sleep plagued by sharp, unfamiliar longings. When she woke, it was late morning and sunlight streamed through the clean glass windows.
Her first thought was of Rai.
That dance. And the way he'd looked at her. She got out of bed, saw that Barb had left her a meet you at breakfast.
Note.
Downstairs, she found Barb already seated at the hotel restaurant, drinking a Bloody Mary.
Hair of the dog, she said.
What happened last
night?
How did I get back to the hotels? I used my superhuman strength and carried you.
Ugh.
That's good for the reputation. You were dressed the whole time, if that helps. And there was no public vomiting. You may or may not have used the men's bathroom. The waitress returned with a second Bloody Mary, which she handed to Frankie. I know I was drunk as shit last night, but you were acting weird, Barb
said.
Was I? Something about the casual response put Barb on alert. So now I know there's a story. Spill the beans, girl. Frankie sighed. Finn used to bring his Naval Academy friends home in the summer. They seemed like gods to me. She smiled a little one and thought maybe it was too sad to be real. Rai Walsh was his best friend. The CO in the sunglasses last night? I had a huge crush on him, The guy who looks like Paul Newman?
Wow.
So, grab his hand and show him. He's engaged.
Shit.
Not again. Barb took a drink. And you're a damn good girl. When I danced with Jamie, I felt safe. Loved, I guess. It was like being home. But with Rai, when I was in his arms, I felt, the way he looked at me was hungry. Almost scary. It's called lust, Frankie, and it can rock your good girl world. Back at the 71st, the only thing that ever changed was the weather. By December, the days were uniformly hot and dry.
Now, with the
temperature rising to 110 degrees in the OR, Frankie was hot and headachy. She hadn't slept well since Saigon. The OR doors opened, and a pair of medics rolled a soldier in from pre-op. He was face down on the gurney, his naked, bloody, but stuck up in the
air.
One of the medics was laughing at something, a good sign.
But
shot, he yelled to Frankie, who showed the medics to an empty table and snapped on a new set of gloves. The kid on the stretcher craned his neck around to look at Frankie.
I
got me a fine black ass, don't I? He said with a glassy-eyed smile that revealed he'd been given some morphine for the pain. He was barely over 18, Frankie would guess. I'm Albert Brown. Private first class. Hey, Private Brown. Yes, you do have one fine ass, I'd say. Too bad. I'm gonna have to pick shrapnel out of it. She waved over the male nurse anesthetist, nicknamed Gasman, who injected a local anesthetic. When the patient's buttocks were numb, Frankie bent over his backside and went to work, tweezing out jagged bits of shrapnel. It would hurt like hell if he could feel it, and he would when the drugs wore off. Where are you from, Albert? Kentucky, ma'am. Land of bourbon and good-looking men. With fine asses, Frankie said. He laughed. I'm glad to represent, ma'am. When she had finished, cleaned him up, and bandaged his backside, she called for a medic to take him to post-op. Wait, ma'am, he said. Can you take a picture with me for my mama? Shirley? She'd love that. Frankie smiled tiredly. It was a common request. Sure, Albert. But your ass looks like it's been chewed by wolves, and so does my hair. Albert grinned. No way, ma'am. You're the prettiest girl who has ever touched my butt. Frankie couldn't help but laugh. She leaned down and let the kids' friend snap a Polaroid picture of them. With a wave, she sent him off to recovery and peeled off her gloves, tossing them away and reaching for a new pair. She was thinking about going for a soda when she heard choppers. Several of them. She glanced across the OR, made eye contact with Barb, who looked as exhausted as Frankie felt. The two nurses ran for the helipad, their feet lost in a cloud of red dirt. They helped offload the wounded and guided them back to Tria. There, they moved through the wounded fast, barking out orders, prioritizing treatment. They were almost done when Frankie heard, "Where do you want him, ma'am?" Two medics appeared, with a wounded man on a litter between them. She took one look at this casualty's wound and said, "Or, stat," and ran along beside the medics. In the OR, she pointed to an empty table and called for Charlene, the newest nurse at the 71st. The poor thing was fresh off the plane. From Kansas. This would be her first shift. Charlene, Frankie said, thrusting a pair of scissors at her. Cut off his clothes. The young blonde woman stared down at the blood falling from the soldier's chest and onto her shiny black combat boots. Frankie saw the woman's fear and thought, "Take a breath, Frankie." She forced her voice to soften as she said, "Look at me. Charlene." Charlene's eyes were full of tears. "Yes, ma'am. It's scary, I know. But you can cut his clothes away and take off his boot. You're a registered nurse." Charlene took the scissors in shaking hands and went to the end of the table. Staring down at what was left of the soldier's left leg, she began to cut away the blood and mud-soaked pants leg. The patient sat up suddenly, saw his mangled leg. "Where's my foot? Where's my foot?" "Doc." "Over here." Frankie reached for a shot of morphine and administered it. "This will help. You'll be okay, Corporal." I'm a bulldogger, ma'am, he said, starting to slur his words as the morphine took effect. In Oklahoma. You smell mighty fine, ma'am, like my girl back home. It's Jean Nate perfume. What's a bulldogger, Marine? Frankie said, looking for a surgeon. Rodeo, ma'am. I surely need that foot. Frankie yelled, is there a damn doc here? Or am I going to do this kid's surgery myself? On her birthday, after a long shift in the OR, Frankie headed to the park, where a party was in full swing. Barb and Slim were standing by the dirty, leaf-infested pool. A banner had been strung between two dying banana trees. Happy birthday, Frankie. A small, tired-looking group of nurses and doctors hooped and clapped at her arrival. Coyote saw Frankie. He leaned over the tiki bar, poured a drink, and brought it to her. In the days since she'd seen him at the O Club in Saigon, he'd shaved his mustache. He looked younger. Happy birthday, Frankie. I'm glad I could be here. Dance with me? She started to say no, but when she looked in his eyes and saw how hard he was working to smile, she realized that they were alike, just trying to conceal the pain of every day here, tired of being alone. Give me a chance, Frankie. I'm a good man. He sounded so earnest, and she knew he meant it, knew that it made sense to do as he asked, so she let herself be pulled forward. She wouldn't sleep with him, wouldn't even let him kiss her. That would be wrong, to lead him on that way, but just now, she was lonely and tired. It was the wrong song and the wrong man and the wrong hand in hers, but honestly it felt good not to be alone. And it was just a dance, after all. Say you'll be my girl. I'm sorry, Coyote, she said softly. For a moment she almost hoped he hadn't heard her. Yeah, he whispered back, his breath hot against her ear. I know. You're out of my league, Frankie McGrath. She tightened her hold on him.
No, Coyote.
You're everything a girl
Could want.
He drew back. Just not you. God, she hated this. Just not me. He pulled her close again, resumed their dance. I love a challenge, Frankie.
You should know that about me.
But I'm going home soon. Short
timer.
So don't lose your chance. He threw his head back and howled, but for the first time, Frankie heard the loneliness in the sound, the sorrow and the heartbreak. She wondered if it had been there all along. December had been a hell of a month in the Highlands. The NVA had killed hundreds of South Vietnamese civilians at Dak too. The OR and the wards had been filled with kids who'd lost their parents, old men who'd lost their daughters, mothers who'd lost their sons. Now, on Christmas Eve, after hours on her feet in the OR, Frankie was exhausted. They were finally done treating the last of the casualties. Hopefully, the remainder of the night would be quiet. Go, Hap said. This is the last one. Go have some eggnog. You sure? Sure as gonorrhea itches.
Go.
Frankie peeled off her gloves and tossed them, along with her cap and gown, into the barrel by the door. Merry Christmas Eve, she said to the corpsman stationed at the desk by the door. Ain't it lovely, he said. You, too, ma'am. She left the OR and emerged into unexpected sunlight.
She found Barb
in the Triov staging area, standing beside a dead black man on a stretcher. An exploding mortar shell had blown off most of his uniform. One side of his face was ripped and charred. It looked like both of his arms and legs were shattered. Explosion blew the dog tags right off him. No name, Barb said.
On
Christmas Eve. Someone will know him. His platoon is in post-op. Yeah, Barb said, carefully placing the soldier's hand on his chest.
She
kept her hand atop his. Frankie knew Barb was thinking of her brother, Will, who'd come home from Vietnam 2 years ago, a different man. Angry, radical,
bound for
trouble. Frankie found a white sheet and covered the dead soldier, whispering, God bless and keep you, soldier. Barb didn't look up. The Stars and Stripes reported no American casualties yesterday. 7 men died in or 1 alone. Frankie nodded. Whatever doubt or hope she'd once held was gone now. The American government was lying about the war. There was no way to avoid that simple truth anymore. LBJ and his generals were lying to the American people, to reporters, to everyone, maybe even to each other. The betrayal was as shocking as the assassination of Kennedy had been, an upheaval of right and wrong. The America Frankie believed in, the shining Camelot of her youth, was gone or lost. Or maybe it had always
Been a lie.
all she knew was that they were here in this faraway country. Soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines and volunteers, risking their lives, and their government could no longer be trusted to tell them the truth.
About why.
Men were still arriving in Vietnam by the thousands, and contrary to what the hippies and the protesters suggested, the majority of them were volunteers, believers in their country. How could the government, and worse, how could the American people, not care about that? Frankie and Barb walked past the morgue, where a pair of corpsmen were processing last night's corpses. Frankie was the first to hear the chopper. She turned and tented a hand over her eyes.
Damn.
The sound of the rotors grew louder. Just one. They rushed to the helipad to help offload the wounded, and saw a Huey gunship touch down. Coyote sat in the left seat. He leaned toward Frankie, grinning.
Just the
"Nurses we hope to see on Christmas Eve," he said. "Want to have some fun? You don't have to ask us twice." Barb jumped up into the chopper, and Frankie followed. Once inside, Frankie saw that Rye was in the right seat, wearing his comms helmet with Riot written across the front. Mirrored aviator sunglasses hid his eyes. He gave her a smile. She answered with a thumbs up. Coyote handed them headsets. Frankie put her headset on and sat on the floor, next to the gunner, positioned at the open door and behind Rye. She let her legs dangle over the side as they took off. They flew over the flat, treeless red swath of the evac hospital, and over the leafless, empty jungle, where dead orange leaves lay on the ground, beside dying trees.
up,
High into the mountains, where the world was impossibly
green.
A few minutes later, Rye said into his mic, "There," and the Huey descended sharply, lowered to about 6 feet above the ground. Hovered.
There.
2 minutes, Coyote. I don't like being a target. Coyote grabbed a rifle and an axe and jumped to the ground. Weapon out, he ran for a stand of trees. Frankie surveyed the open area. Charlie could be anywhere, hiding in the lush green jungle. They could have planted bouncing betties or punji stakes, sharpened sticks, stabbed deep in the ground and coated with human feces to assure both a deep wound and infection when stepped on. "This is crazy," Frankie said. "What's he doing?" Moments later, it felt like an eternity. Coyote came back, carrying a straggly tree. He tossed it into the back of the chopper and climbed up into the left seat. "All that for a tree?" Frankie yelled into her microphone. "You two are crazy." "A Christmas tree," Coyote said, laughing as the helicopter spun and arced back up toward the clouds. 20 minutes later, they landed back at the 71st. Coyote turned and pulled off his helmet and smiled. "Riot and I figured you gals needed a Christmas tree." Barb laughed. Frankie thought it might be the truest laugh she'd ever heard from her friend. "You seawolves sure live up to your crazy-ass shit reputation, I gotta say," Barb said. "I just hope you have a turkey to go along with it, or my mama would whoop your ass for playing with a girl's tender heart." Coyote grinned. "And a pecan pie, all the way from my mama's kitchen in San Antonio." They put the tree up in their hooch and decorated the scrawny branches with anything they could find. Paper clips, strips of aluminum foil, empty Sierration can lids, lengths of tubing, Kelly clamps. It stood in the corner in all its Charlie Brown glory. Barb made a tinfoil star for the top. Rye and Coyote sat on Frankie's cot, watching the decorations accumulate.
White
Christmas played through the speakers of Barb's transistor radio. Frankie was on her knees in front of the tree, stringing a loop of paper. clips from one branch to another. When Coyote said, "We need drinks." "Hot damn, Flyboy, you're right," Barb said, and the two of them left. The hooch. Frankie heard the metal frame of her cot squeak as Rye got to his feet. She heard him coming closer, felt him standing behind her. Every cell in her body seemed attuned to his presence. Slowly, she stood up, but didn't turn
Around.
"Thanks for this," she said. "It was crazy and stupid and dangerous and lovely. I didn't want to think about you," he said.
She turned to him at last. Their gazes met, held.
She felt her breathing speed up. Lust, Barb had said. Was it that simple? There was no reason to pretend she didn't feel it. If she'd learned anything during her tour, it was this. Say what you meant while you could.
"You're engaged," she said.
"And I know it's old-fashioned, but I can't be. The other woman. I couldn't live with myself."
"You do know we're at war," he said.
"Please tell me you aren't going to try the 'we could die tomorrow' line on me." He stepped back. "You're right. I'm wrong. Merry Christmas Eve, Frankie. I won't bother you again. You don't need to go." "Yes, I do. You do something to me." Long after he and Coyote had gone, while Barb and Frankie drank eggnog and listened to Christmas music and opened their gifts from home, the echo of those words remained. "You do something to me." The Christmas ceasefire held, giving everyone at the 71st time to enjoy a real holiday meal in the mess hall. Turkey, mashed potatoes and gravy, green beans, sausage stuffing, and sweet potato casserole, pecan and pumpkin pies. Afterward, a group walked over to the park, where Frankie had hung up a banner, "Bon Voyage, L.T. Johnson. We will miss your sorry
ass."
Barb's send-off party. Now Frankie and Barb sat in beach chairs tucked in close to the stand of banana trees. A party raged beside them. Music blared. A sorry-looking tinsel tree, decorated with red bows, leaned brokenly against the tiki bar. "I guess we'd better talk about it now, Frankie," Barb said, handing Frankie a lighter. Frankie lit her cigarette. "About you leaving? I'd rather not. You're the only thing I don't want to leave behind." Frankie turned to her friend. In this light, Barb's afro looked like a dark halo. If you didn't look in her eyes, you might think she was an ordinary 25-year-old. Frankie couldn't calculate all that her friendship with Barb had given her. Barb had shown Frankie glimpses of a world she'd not
been exposed to or taught much about.
Frankie had thought the passage of the Civil Rights Act was a triumphant end. Barb had shown her that it was a fragile beginning. She knew that Barb was scared for her brother, Will, and his Black Panther affiliation, but she was proud of it, too. She knew about fighting for things. Even though she had a master's degree in nursing, she'd had to fight to get sent to Vietnam, and then she'd had to fight again to get assigned to an evac hospital. Black officers were few and far between over here, but Barb had been determined that black soldiers should see a black nurse in the hospital. Barb leaned back, sighed. She took a drag, exhaled smoke slowly.
"I
can't take another tour," she said at last. "I know that. I'll miss you too, Frankie." The next morning, when Frankie woke, the first thing she saw was Barb's empty cot. The posters above the bed, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, and Martin Luther King, Jr., had been removed. All that was left were tufts of paper on thumbtacks pushed into the wooden walls. Things ripped away, pieces left behind. A metaphor for life in Vietnam. Frankie saw a folded-up note on the dresser beside her cot.
She
unfolded it slowly. December 26, 1967. Dearest Frankie, call me a coward. I should have wakened you when my bird showed up, but you were actually sleeping, and we both know how rare that is over here. I didn't want you to see me crying. I love you. You know that, and I know that you love me, and when that's in place, we don't need a goodbye. So I'll say, see you. Come visit me in Georgia. I'll teach you about grits and collard greens, and you can meet my mama. It's a whole different world from your little island, trust me. Until then, sister.
Keep your head down. And now.
I know losing Jamie hurt like hell, but you're still young. Don't let this damn war take that too. I saw the way your Mr. Cool looks at you. Lord, I'd kill for a man to look at me like that. Life over here is short, and regret lasts forever. Maybe happy now, happy for a moment is all we really get. Happy forever seems a shitload to ask in a world on fire.
Be cool. Be.
Beside Frankie on the dresser was a Polaroid picture of Barb, Ethel, and Frankie, all of them in shorts and t-shirts and combat boots, arms around each other, smiles so big and bold it seemed impossible that this was a wartime photograph. The beaded door of the O Club was behind them. Frankie could almost hear the multicolor beads clattering together, pushed by rain or wind. For all of it, they'd had good times. She hoped they remembered that. January 5th, 1968. Dear Frankie, I promised to write when I landed back in the good ol' US of A.
I
am home with my mama for now and sitting on my porch sipping some sweet tea. Kids are playing kick the can in the street out front. Their laughter is something. I miss you. I miss us. I even miss the 71st. Speaking of that, you'll never guess who is on my freedom bird.
Coyote.
Lordy, that boy has it bad for you. Showed me a picture of you two at the O Club in Saigon, but don't you worry. He'll find a sparkly little cowgirl in Texas. Life here isn't what I expected. I took a job at my local hospital, and honestly, I'm bored to tears. I need to find a new path. I'm sick of being treated like a candy striper. There's not a lot of love for us veterans here. I don't know what I'll do now. It's hard to go from red alert, sirens, and saving lives to pantyhose and heels. The world might be changing, but we women are still second-class citizens.
And black
women.
Well,
you do the math. Life isn't calm back here. Race riots, war protests. Dr. Spock was arrested for telling guys to resist the draft. The National Guard being called out. But it isn't war. I'm kind of at loose ends. Mama recommends more food and dating. Last week she bought me a used sewing machine. I guess she thinks perfecting a blind stitch hem will revive me. I'm thinking I need a change. Maybe this little town is just too small for me now. But where would I go? Anyway, stay safe and keep your flak jacket close. Save some lives for me.
B.
On a quiet day in mid-January of 1968, Frankie's Darrows came in.
She
tacked the paper up on the plywood wall above her cot and drew a big red circle around March 15th and an X through today. She was officially a short-timer. At 0400 hours, on January 31st, a rocket hit the 71st. Explosions ripped through the night. The red alert siren blared. Frankie scrambled out of bed, grabbed her flak jacket and steel pot helmet from underneath the bed, and dressed quickly. Another rocket hit. The hooch shook. A rat ran across the floor, looking
for shelter.
Frankie's new hooch mate, Margie Sloan, sat up in bed and screamed. What's happening? Oh my God. The red alert siren sounded again, became continuous. Over the loudspeaker the words, "Attention all personnel, take cover. Security alert.
Condition red.
We are under rocket attack. Repeat. Condition red.
Take
cover. We've got to get to the hospital," Frankie yelled as she ran to the door. Flung it open. Outside, the camp was filled with fire and smoke. Buildings on fire, black smoke billowing, acrid smelling. An oil drum behind the latrines burst into flames. One of the 400-gallon water trailers positioned above the showers exploded. Water geysered out. Margie.
Now.
Margie moved in beside her. We can't go out there. Frankie grabbed Margie's hand. Wish there was more time to ease the young nurse into a night like this. I know it's scary, Margie, and I wish you weren't so green. But one thing at a time, okay? Put on your flak and steel
pot.
My what? Your helmet. Put it on and get to the ER. Help with triage. I can't. You can. It was all the time Frankie had. As she ran for the oar, something big exploded behind her. The Red Cross building, maybe. Outside the oar, personnel in flak jackets and helmets, some still in pajamas or shorts and combat boots, were running to the different wards, readying for wounded, carrying sawhorses to Tria. The alert warning continued to blare out. In the oar, Frankie got the lights on, the tables ready, the supplies carted. And at hand, dressing carts, crash carts, thoracostomy trays, oxygen tanks, a portable suction machine. She sure wished Hap were still here, but he'd shipped out 2 months ago. Their newest doc had been here a week. It was going to be a tough night for him. She heard the first dust-off arrive at 0430. The first wave of casualties hit pre-op and the oar minutes later. Too many for the operating tables they had, for the nurses, for the medics. Wounded lay on litters set on sawhorses, prepped for surgery and waiting. She saw civilians, heard a child crying for her mother. Had the U.S. bombed another South Vietnamese village? As Frankie scrubbed in and masked up, she could hear the constant whine and thump of shells ripping the camp apart. The Quonset hut shook. IVs rattled in their holders. Her helmet kept clanking down onto the bridge of her nose. Another hit. Close. In the oar, the wounded who were able rolled off their beds or litters and hit the floor, their IVs yanked out of their veins. Frankie grabbed pillows, blankets, whatever she could find to lay over the patients who were too wounded to move. It wouldn't save them from a direct hit, but it was all she could do. The lights went out. Total darkness. Then the generators hummed to life and brought light back. Frankie went to the nearest operating table, saw the soldier lying there. He was barely conscious, moaning for help. His uniform had been cut off in Triov, exposing the devastation of his chest wound. He was bleeding everywhere. Bits of shrapnel were embedded in his neck. "I've got you," she said, putting her strength into applying pressure to the chest wound. The patient gasped, tried to breathe, panicked. He bucked up. "Calm down, soldier," Frankie said, looking for a doctor. "We need a trach here. Stat." All she saw was a sea of wounded men and medics rushing in and out. She yanked a surgical cart close. The array of silver instruments lay ready. She'd never performed a tracheotomy before, but she'd watched and assisted on dozens. Hap had shown her how to do it step by step. She looked around, called again for a doctor. In the chaos, there was no answer. She swabbed antiseptic on the anterior aspect of the man's throat and picked up a scalpel and made her incision, opening a direct airway in his trachea. Blood bubbled up. She blotted it away and inserted a tracheal tube. He took a gasping breath and released it, calmed. She taped the tube in place and grabbed some gauze and went back to his chest wound. "Where's a goddamn doctor?" she yelled. The noise in the oar was deafening. IVs and bottles and instruments and carts crashed to the cement floor. The lights flickered. Wounded streamed from Triov into the oar. The new doctor skidded into the oar, slipping on the bloody floor, almost falling. He wore his flak jacket and helmet. "Captain Morse." "Mark, I need you." He stared at her, not seeming to comprehend. "Now," she yelled. He looked down at the patient's sucking chest wound. Holy shit! Frankie knew what the doctor was feeling. Unfortunately, there was no time to let him know that. This wounded soldier needed the doctor's best. And now, look at his face. Document. See him. See Specialist Glenn Short. The young doctor's gaze moved slowly up to Frankie's face. His eyes were wide with fear. She nodded in understanding, said, "See him." "Anesthesia," Frankie yelled, waving the nurse anesthetist over. "Go on, doc," she said, as the patient was anesthetized. "Get scrubbed up. Get your gloves on." "You've got this," she said. "We make little holes out of big ones, right? Go on." The attack went on for so long that Frankie finally took off her unwieldy flak jacket and oversized helmet and stopped even flinching at the sound of explosions or shelling. For hours, The evac hospital overflowed with casualties. Pre-op, the ER, the OR, the ICU, and the Vietnamese ward were all wall-to-wall beds, and there was overflow, but at last they were nearing the end of the push. All of the casualties had been operated on. Now Frankie stood in the middle of the OR, sopping the sweat from her brow, watching Dr. Morse finish the last
surgery.
She knew he would fall apart soon, start shaking and be unable to stop, but he was still going. That meant he had what it took. McGrath, a medic, yelled from the doorway. "Someone wants you out." "Here." "Stat." Frankie ran out of the OR, saw Rye standing outside, covered in blood and mud. "Are you hurt?" "It's not my blood." He pulled her into his arms, held her tightly. "You're okay," he said shakily, and then, steadier, "You're okay." He drew back, stared down at her. "I heard about the direct hit here, and all I could think about was you." "I thought," he began. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." He let her go, but she didn't step back. It had felt so good to be in his arms, to be comforted, even for a moment.
"Just another shit day at the
71st, she said, trying to smile. "Come on, Frankie," he said. "I'm taking you out of here." "There is no out of here," she said tiredly. He held her hand and led her away from the OR. The compound was a stinking, smoldering mess. Something over by the park was on fire, lighting up a sky that would soon be darkening again. Rye said, "I've never seen a night like this." Frankie started to say something. She had no idea what, when she heard a soldier moan in pain. She yelled, "Medic," and ran toward the morgue overflow area, where there were rows of canvas-covered dead bodies. A pair of exhausted-looking corpsmen were managing it all, gathering the names of the dead, checking dog tags, zipping the bodies into
bags.
Over to the left, there was a single litter left on a pair of sawhorses.
She
saw blood dripping down from the sides and through the canvas bottom. She heard the patient moan again. "Wesley, has this soldier been given morphine?" she asked one of the corpsmen. "Yes, ma'am." Doc Morse saw him. Said he couldn't do any more. Frankie nodded and went to the man on the litter. She felt Rye come up beside her. There was almost nothing left of a man who had been whole minutes ago. Field dressings were blood-soaked on 3 missing limbs. Blood and mud covered what remained of his face. She reached for his dog tags so that she could comfort him by name. "Hey, Pre." Her voice broke. "Private Albert Brown." "Hey, Albert," she said softly. "Did you come by to show me that fine ass of yours again?" She leaned over the dying man, barely older than a boy, and placed a hand on his ruined chest. His head lolled toward her. One eye looked at her. She knew he recognized her when his eye filled with tears. "I'm here, Albert. You're not alone." She held his hand.
It was all she
could do for him in this moment, be the girl back home he'd never had.
"I'll
bet you're thinking about your family, Albert. In Kentucky, wasn't it? Land of bourbon and good-looking men." "I'll write to your mama," Frankie couldn't remember his mother's name. She knew it, but couldn't remember. It felt like another loss, her not remembering. Albert tried to speak. Whatever he wanted to say, it was too much. He closed his one eye, his breathing turned as clunky as an old motor. Frankie felt his last breath expand and empty through her own lungs. And then he was gone. Frankie let out a heavy breath and turned to Rye. "God, I'm tired of this." Rye picked her up in his arms and carried her through the burning, smoking camp, past people drawn together in groups, grieving for what had been lost. The mess hall was half gone, as were the Red Cross offices. Giant smoking pits spat fire into the falling night. The door to her hooch lay in pieces in the dirt. Rye carried her inside and set her down on the narrow cot. She slumped forward. "We have too many F&Gs here. We needed Barb and Ethel and Hap and Jamie tonight." Rye sat on the cot's edge, stroked her back. "Go to sleep, Frankie." She leaned against him. His mama's name was Shirley, she whispered, remembering too late. Surely, I'll write to her as. Exhausted and lonely as she felt, it would have been easy to turn to Rai, to reach for him, to let him hold and soothe her. Longing came with the thought. She lay down and closed her eyes, almost whispered, "Stay until I'm asleep." But what would be the point? Hours later, when she woke, he was gone. The Stars and Stripes called it the Tet Offensive, a massive coordinated attack across the country by the North Vietnamese in the early hours of January 31st, 1968, the bloodiest day of the Vietnam War so far. The attack blew the doors off the secret side of the war. Apparently, when Walter Cronkite reported on the Tet carnage, he'd said, on air, "What the hell is going on? I thought we were winning the war." Suddenly, everyone in the media was asking the question, what in the hell is going on in Vietnam? On February 2nd, LBJ used death as the success matrix of Tet, claiming that 10,000 North Vietnamese had died and only 249 Americans. "I can count," the president said, implying that hearts stopped were what mattered. He didn't even mention the South Vietnamese casualties. 249 American deaths. A lie, Frankie was sure, given the number of deaths she'd witnessed at the 71st alone. But who knew the truth? The next morning, Frankie stood at the bedside of a young South Vietnamese woman who'd been brought in late the previous night, burned, and in the throes of labor. The team had done everything they could to save the baby, but it hadn't been possible. The woman was sitting up in bed, holding her dead newborn in bandaged arms. Beneath those white gauze bandages, the skin had been charred to black, but the woman hadn't even cried out when Frankie debrided the dead flesh. She'd made a sound only when she tried to take the baby. Unbearable grief. So many dead and dying and lost. Her hooch mate, Margie, approached Frankie, offered her a hot coffee. The cup shook in her unsteady hand. "Are you okay?" "How could any of us be okay?" Frankie answered. "Well, you're on your way out. Just think. You're going home." Frankie nodded. She'd been looking forward to going home, longing for it, dreaming about it, but suddenly she pictured it. Coronado Island, Mom and Dad, and the country club. What would it actually be like, being home, living with her parents? How could she go from red alert sirens and saving lives to butter knives and champagne glasses? "I don't know how we'll manage without you," Margie said. Frankie turned to look at Margie, whose eyes were red from crying. The young nurse was nowhere near ready for what was to come. She would be. Someday, probably, but not yet. There was no nurse here, with the experience Frankie had. How could she leave this hospital and the casualties, American and South Vietnamese, who needed her? She'd come here to make a difference, to save lives, and God knew lives still needed saving. As much as she sometimes hated the war, she loved nursing more. February 3rd, 1968. Dear Mom and Dad, this is a difficult letter to write, and I am sure it will be difficult to read. I apologize in advance. I wish I could just pick up the phone and call you, but believe me, the Mars phone is not our friend. It sounds crazy and absurd, but I have found my calling here in Vietnam. I love what I do, and I make a real difference. As you know, the war is heating up. I know the media and the government are lying to the American people, but I'm sure you've heard of the Tet Offensive. More troops arrive every day, and a lot of them end up wounded. We do our best to save them, and if they can't be saved, like Finley, I sit with them and hold their hands and let them know they aren't alone. I write letters to their mothers, their sisters, their wives. Can you imagine what such a letter would have meant to us? So, I am not coming home next month. I have signed up for another 1-year tour of duty. I simply can't leave my post when the men need me. We don't have enough experienced staff here. There. I can hear you screaming. If you knew me now, you'd understand. I am a combat nurse. I love you both. F. February 17th, 1968. Dear Francis Grace. No, no, no. Change your mind. Come home. Be safe. You could get hurt over there. Enough.
Come home now.
Your father is extremely unhappy with this idea, I might add. Much.
Love.
Your mother. March 1st, 1968. Dear Frank.
Of course you're staying.
I never doubted it. You're as tough as dried-out rope and the men need you. God knows it's strange here, too. Nixon announced that he's running for president and state troopers used tear gas to stop a
protest.
Holy crap. Nothing makes sense. Still, strangely, life goes on. I'm in veterinary school at long last. And working my ass off. I've joined the local orchestra and am back to playing the violin. It helps a bit, although I still don't sleep well. Come visit me when you're back in the world. I'm waiting with open arms. We have a new mare that is a dream for beginners. Nothing soothes the soul like a gallop in the sunshine. Love. Ethel. On a blisteringly hot day in early March, Frankie began her shift, tired and jittery from a lack of sleep. The OR hadn't been especially busy in the past week. There had been lots of time for games and movie nights and writing letters home. Frankie had even jumped on a slick ship, a Huey stripped down for transport, and gone to Canaan for an afternoon of shopping. Even so, she was on edge. Peevish, demanding too much from the people around her.
It didn't help that
they were short-staffed. Frankie knew she should reach out to the newer nurses, especially Margie, and mentor them, but she was worn out
and
lonely. Lieutenant McGrath. She turned, saw Captain Miniver, the new, by-the-book chief nurse of the 71st, holding a clipboard close to her chest, her body stiffly upright. Lieutenant McGrath. Yes, Captain? I've been informed that you have failed to take an R and are this tour. And your new tour starts in 2 weeks. Who ratted me out? Someone who cares about you, obviously. A little bird.
Barb.
Barb who? She smiled. Anyway, I'm ordering you to go. I have your itinerary right here. A beach hotel on Kauai sounds ideal. It's a farther flight, but there will be fewer soldiers looking for boom boom there. I'm needed. None of us is irreplaceable, McGrath. I have been watching you, getting reports on the level of bitchiness you've recently achieved.
It's
impressive. Her expression softened. In it, Frankie saw understanding. You need a break. You think a little hula time will fix me? It won't hurt. Either way, you leave tomorrow. Here's your itinerary.
Go. Rest.
Drink cocktails that come with umbrellas. Sleep. I could be saving your life, McGrath. Trust me. I've been where you are. We all can.
Break.
After more than 22 hours of travel, Frankie stumbled into the lobby of the Cocoa Palms Hotel on the island of Kauai and checked in. Once in her room, without bothering to shower, she yanked the curtains, closed and collapsed onto the softest bed she'd ever felt and fell asleep. When she woke, she heard birds singing.
Birds. Singing.
No mortars exploding or shells hammering the walls. No smell of blood. Or shit or smoke in the air. No screaming. No dust-off swirling overhead. The captain had been right. Frankie needed this respite. She lay in bed, feeling drowsy in a lovely way and listening to the unexpected birdsong, surprised to see that it was well past noon. Refreshed and revived, she got out of bed and pushed the heavy gardenia print yellow wand white drapes aside and saw Kauai for the first time.
Wow.
The California beaches were magnificent, powerful, endless, and awe-inspiring, but this was an intimate kind of beauty, drenched in jewel tones, golden sand, vivid green grass, deep blue skies, vibrant purple bougainvilleas. She opened the window and leaned out into the bright, beautiful day. The air smelled of a sweet floral fragrance mingled with the sharp tang of
the sea.
Palm trees grew on a flat patch of lawn, singly and in groups. She took a long, hot, luxurious bath, using soap that smelled of coconut and washed and dried her hair, seeing for the first time how long it had
grown.
She'd spent months pruning it as she would a runaway weed, cutting away whatever impaired her view, which left her with an uneven fringe of bangs. Thankfully, she had her boonie hat. It wasn't fashionable. In fact, was the opposite, but the olive drab hat had become a favorite possession in Nam, almost a companion, and it kept the sun out of her
eyes.
A dozen pins and patches decorated the crown, gifts she'd gotten from her patients. Each bore the insignia of some unit. The screaming eagles, the sea wolves, the big red one. She put on her faded two-piece knit bathing suit and SKI Vietnam t-shirt and shorts, noticing that everything bore the pink-red tint of the Vietnam
soil.
For the first time in months, she bothered with makeup, mascara, and lipstick and blush. Slipping into sandals, she put on sunglasses, grabbed a hotel towel, and went down to the lobby. Although she was hungry, her stomach was grumbling loudly. She needed fresh air more. Fresh air and the sound of the sea. A little sand between her toes, a little floating in salt water. She left the hotel and walked through the manicured grounds, palm trees swaying all around her. She crossed the quiet street and stepped out onto the sand. Tomorrow she would bring her camera and take pictures of the beauty around her. On this sunny day, locals and tourists filled the beach. Families on blankets, parents keeping watchful eyes on their children, some of whom were naked, all of whom were smiling brightly. There were men with long hair, wearing peace symbol necklaces, and several men in khaki shorts, their hair buzzed to regulation length, standing at a lava rock beach bar with a thatched roof, seashell snack bar, and cocktails read the sign. Out in the ocean, she saw kids on surfboards, bobbing on the incoming swells. It made her think of Finley, made her miss him acutely. That's your
wave, doll.
Paddle harder. She let out a long breath. It had become a kind of goodbye, her way of releasing her grief just enough to keep going. She stripped down to her bathing suit and walked into the sea. The water was warmer than she was used to in California, but still cool. Sunshine sparkled on the surface. She swam beyond the low, incoming curl of surf and flipped onto her back in the calm swells. Eyes closed, she felt almost young again, a girl floating on waves with the sun streaming down on her. Finally, she left the water and staked out a patch of sand, all by herself. No one around, and laid out her towel. Eyes shielded by her boonie hat and big round sunglasses, she drifted to sleep, slept deeply, and woke with the sun lowered in the sky. She sat up, brought her knees up, and stared out to sea. Treasured images came to her of Finley paddling out on his surfboard, waving his hand, telling her to catch up, of them on the beach, bouncing uncomfortably on the backs of their rental horses, Finley muttering something about the family jewels, and the sunsets they'd watched together as they spun out their childish dreams and talked about their future. "Can I buy you a drink, ma'am?" Frankie shook herself free of the memories and looked up. A young man stood in front of her, shirtless, wearing khaki shorts and a military belt. A Semper Fi tattoo covered the top left quadrant of his chest. She could tell by his eyes that he'd been in country, maybe in the bush. She wondered how long the men would wear that hunted look. She hated to let him down. "Sorry, Marine. I came here for the quiet. Stay safe." He turned away, no doubt scouting the beach for another girl to approach. Frankie began to feel the sting of a sunburn and noticed how pink her legs were. How long had she been out here? She heard someone else coming her way. She should have gone farther. Down the beach, away from the snack bar. This time she didn't look up. "I'm fine alone, thanks." "Are you?" She slowly looked up, lowered her big round sunglasses. "Right." He stood at ease, his hands clasped behind him. He wore multicolored shorts and a pale blue t-shirt that read Live TO Surf, but no one would mistake him for a surfer, not with his military posture and built-up muscles. and unfashionably short hair. "This is quite a coincidence," Frankie said. "It's no coincidence. I worked hard to get you to take R. So you're the little bird who ratted me out."
"Why?" "To see you."
"Right, I told you. I broke off my engagement. That stopped her." "You did." "I couldn't pretend anymore, not after Tet. Life is short, and he
paused.
"There's something between us, Frankie."
"Tell me you don't feel it."
"And I'll walk away." Frankie stood up to face him. "Say you don't want me?" The way he said it revealed an unexpected vulnerability. There was no way in the world she could flirt with him or lie. "I can't say that," she said evenly. He finally released a breath. "Will you have dinner with me tonight?" She knew it wasn't just dinner he wanted. She wanted more, too.
Still,
he was Rye Walsh, the rule-breaker who'd pushed her brother into trouble. More than once. Not that Finley needed much help in that regard, and she knew she wouldn't be safe with a man like him. But he was still an officer. And hopefully a gentleman. "You broke off your engagement? You swear?"
"I
swear I'm not engaged." Frankie stared at him, felt a spark of excitement, like coming alive after a long hibernation. "Dinner sounds great." Frankie stood in line at the pay phone for 30 minutes. In the past year, she'd called stateside only twice, on Christmas and her mother's birthday. Barb answered on the second ring, sounded harried and distracted. "Hello,
Barb."
"It's me, Frankie. It is so good to hear your voice." Frankie leaned her elbows on the cool metal shelf below the pay phone. A small stack of quarters stood at the ready. She hoped it would be enough. She could only imagine how expensive this call would be. "I'm in Kauai on my R&R. Wait, I'll join you." Ordinarily, I'd jump on that, but she glanced around, made sure no one could hear her. "Rye Walsh is here. Mr. Cool?" He broke off his engagement. "Maybe for me. The point is, I need
advice."
"What if he wants to have sex?" "I guarantee you, he wants to have sex."
"Call me telepathic."
"If you weren't such a damn Catholic schoolgirl, you would, too." "I do.
I mean, I might.
But I need some practical advice." The operator came on to ask for more money. Frankie put in the rest of her quarters.
"Use birth control," Barb said.
"It'll have to be condoms. Unless you have a fake wedding ring."
"What?"
"They won't give single women the pill."
"Don't even get me started on."
"That's shit, but if you pretend you're married, you can get it." "Not that it will work by tonight."
"So yeah,
condoms. Get lots." "Seriously, Babs. I need, step-by-step kind of stuff." "They did have sex ed in your all-girls school, didn't they?" "Did you sleep through it?" "And in nursing school." "Shut up.
Help me."
"What do I?" "Believe me, Frankie. That man has the sex part down."
"Just try not to."
"Tense up and don't expect too much the first time. It can hurt a bit." "That's not very detailed." "Okay, shave your legs and armpits. Wear sexy lingerie," Barb said, laughing.
"Oh."
"And be bold. Not ladylike. And don't believe him if he says he loves you."
"What?"
"Why?" The connection ended. Frankie left the lobby and hailed a cab, which took her into the small town of Lihue. There, she got her hair cut in a chin-length, side-parted bob, and bought a red and white hibiscus print sheath dress with a matching headscarf and heeled white sandals. Back at the hotel, she followed Barb's advice and shaved carefully and moisturized her sunburned skin. As she stood in her hotel room bathroom and stared into the opalescent, shell-framed mirror that hung over a large clamshell sink, she hardly recognized herself. The beautician had brought back the shine in her black hair, and the sleek haircut emphasized her blue eyes and the sharp line of her
cheekbones.
There was still an air of sadness about her, the sorrow she'd learned in Vietnam. She wondered if that would ever fade.
But there was a
youthful excitement in her look, too.
Hope.
Long since forgotten and never again to be taken for granted. At 18:30 hours, she left her room and went downstairs. The ceiling of the hotel lobby arched high overhead, soared up like the nave of a church. She entered the open-air dining room. Beyond the half-walls she saw the shadowy lagoons where tiki torches blazed. Coconut palm fronds swayed and whispered, stark black trees against a violet sky. Somewhere, someone was playing a ukulele. Most of the tables were full of vacationers, talking, laughing, smoking. It was a sharp reminder that while she'd been in Vietnam, the world had
Gone on.
Kids had gone to school, parents had gone to work. Not everyone lived and breathed the war. In Nam, it was easy to hear about the protests going on in America and think that everyone was burning the flag and protesting for peace. Here, it was obvious that most people had quietly gone on with their lives, avoiding the dangerous shores on either side of the divide. She saw Rice seated at a quiet table in the back corner. A lovely Hawaiian woman, dressed in a floor-length barkcloth print. Mumu, wearing a fragrant lei, led her across the busy restaurant. As she neared the table, Rice stood, waited for her to be seated before he sat back down. He offered her a gorgeous lei made of small yellow-white flowers. It's white ginger. The fragrance was intoxicating. "May I bring you a cocktail?" the hostess asked when Frankie was seated. "Perhaps a Mai Tai?" The hotel's owner, Mrs. Guslander, believes it is the best cocktail in the world. Frankie nodded.
Yes.
"Thank you. I'll have a Jameson on the rocks," Rice said. The hostess left them alone. The candle in the center of the table sent golden light upward. The hostess returned with the 2 drinks and a pair of menus. The Mai Tai was sweet and sour and strong. Frankie toyed with the pink umbrella, lifted it, ate the sweet maraschino cherry and chunk of pineapple. She knew this dinner with him meant something, maybe everything, but she felt awkward. She could reach into a man's chest and hold his heart in her hands, but she had forgotten how to make small talk. Rice stared down into his glass, rattled his ice cubes around. "Ice," Frankie said, "just to be talking. I'll never take that for granted. Again. Or a hot bath. Or dry sheets." The waitress appeared, took their orders, and disappeared again. Frankie could tell that he was uncertain, too. They knew each other only in the flimsiest of ways, and now he'd broken off an engagement for a chance that might come to nothing. The waitress delivered 2 shrimp cocktails. Frankie dipped a plump, pink shrimp in the spicy cocktail sauce and took a bite, chewing slowly. "You remember the night of Finley's going-away parties?" "A going-away party for Vietnam," he said. "Talk about another world. We didn't know." He took a drink. "No," he said quietly. "We didn't. Did you ever talk to Finn about Vietnam? I mean, really talk?" Rai looked away just for a moment. In his hesitation, she saw regret. "We were at Annapolis," he said. "It was all rah-rah Navy. And he believed in it. He wanted to make your dad proud of him." "I know that." "Yeah," Frankie said. "My dad. The Heroes' Wall. We met there at the party." Rice smiled at this shared memory. "Both of us hiding out. What were you hiding from?" "I'm a poor kid from Compton. I didn't know how to act at your house. How to dress. Anything."
"And what?" "Well,
if we're telling all our secrets here, I followed you into the office." "You're kidding." "I wanted to ask you to the ring dance in 65. Did Finn ever tell you?"
"That."
"No. He asked me not to, said you were too good for the likes of me."
He
was smiling when he said it, but I knew he meant it. We both ended up taking a different kind of girl, shall we say? The kind who didn't mind steaming up the windows of a parked car. Frankie said, smiling. "That sounds like Finn." I knew he was right. I had nothing in common with a woman like you. Still, I followed you into the office that night, thought I'd steal a kiss, but I could tell you weren't ready. And now, here we are, Frankie said in understanding. They had made it through hardship, death all around, to be here, sipping cocktails on a tropical island. Did it mean something? How would they know unless they dared to begin? They needed first to get to know each other. So she said, "Tell me about your family. Do you have siblings?"
Ah.
20 questions. Good choice. No siblings. My mom was an English teacher. Loved Yeats. The old man still lives in Compton.
Bought.
The place in the 30s. Thinks the city has gone to hell around him.
He
Owns a car repair shop. Stanley and Moe's. Although there's no MO, no one could stand my old man for long. Not even his brother. The waitress appeared at their table, paused, then said, "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir, but there's a gentleman at the bar. He requests a moment of your time." Behind her, at the dark Lavarock bar area, an elderly man in an out-of-style suit and tie stood and waved. "Of course," Rye answered. The man who approached them walked in a slow, limping gait.
he was
Tall and thin, wearing an expensive linen suit that seemed sized for a larger
man.
He had a thin mustache and neatly trimmed hair. "Edgar Latour," he said in a lyrical Louisiana drawl. "Captain. U.S. Army. I'm guessing you're here on leave," he said to Rye. "We both are, sir. This is Lieutenant Francis McGrath. Army nurse."
I'm
"Navy." Edgar grinned. "Well, I won't hold that against you, boy.
I just want to
Say thank you for what you boys and girls, I guess, are doing to fight.
communism.
It's a tough world out there, and you need to know that a lot of us still appreciate your sacrifice. I'd be honored to buy your meal. That isn't necessary, no, but my honor. And, ma'am, a woman like you saved my life in France. Bless you." Moments after the man left, the waitress brought their entrees: lamb roasted in a fire pit, baby peas, and buttery potatoes risole. Throughout the meal, they talked about their hopes for life after Vietnam, the friends they'd made over there, the protests going on back home. When dinner was over, after a fabulous baked Alaska, Rye picked up a picnic basket at his feet and offered Frankie his arm. They walked out of the restaurant, past a trio of women dancing the hula in the lobby to the sweet strains of the ukulele. Outside, the hotel grounds were a wonderland of shadow and moonlight, and tiki torches. The grounds enveloped them in fragrance and sound, sweet ginger and plumeria and a warm, salt-tinged breeze. Flaming tiki torches stood amid elegant manicured landscaping. The lagoons lapped quietly against the shore as they walked over the arched bridge. Rye led her to the beach, where he found a private, perfect spot, far from the closed-up snack shack, and unpacked the basket he'd brought.
A
Blanket, several votive candles and holders, a pack of matches, a bottle of champagne, and 2 glasses. He set it all out on the sand and poured her a glass of champagne. "You're prepared," she said, not sure whether she felt romanced or manipulated. "Romanced won out. Always," he said with a smile. "I was an Eagle Scout." "Really?" "No," he laughed. "Scouting wasn't the sort of thing offered in my neighborhood." They sat down on the blanket. Each stared up at the white spray of the Milky Way. He pointed out constellations, told her the stories that went along with each one. Halfway through one of those stories, Frankie turned to ask him something. At the same time, he turned to her. They stared at each other, neither speaking for a moment. Then Rye leaned forward slowly, his gaze questioning. "May I kiss you, Frankie?" She nodded. He leaned toward her. She met him more than halfway. It wasn't until the last second, when his lips touched hers, that she remembered to close her eyes. The kiss went on, until she felt his hand slide down her back, guide her body toward the sand. They stretched out on the blanket, moving together without a word. She waited for him to reach under her dress or kiss down her throat, to push for more the way the boys she knew had always done, but he didn't. He seemed content to kiss her deeply, bringing her closer to some edge she hadn't known existed that left her dizzy with desire, and still he was a gentleman. For the first time, she was the one who wanted more. In all the world, all the universe, they'd come together somehow, halfway around the world, and it felt like destiny. She drew back and looked at him. Since childhood, she'd been taught that this kind of need was wrong, immoral, a sin unless it happened in a marriage.
We can wait, he said.
In 6 days we'll be back in Vietnam. She thought about the helicopter pilots that had come through her, or about Finn and Jamie and the heartbreak of loss. I don't want to wait. Are you sure? I'm sure. She looked at him, scared but sure. I don't know what to do. I do. He kissed her chin, along her throat, across the swell of her breasts. He unzipped the back of her dress, eased it down her body, leaving goosebumps along her skin. Somehow, he'd released her bra without her knowing it, and she felt his mouth on her breasts. Oh my God, she whispered. He kept kissing her, touching her, awakening her body. She fought it for a moment, tried to hold herself together. It felt as if she were unraveling. Relax, baby, he said, pulling her dress farther down her panties until she lay naked in the starlight, shivering. Somewhere deep inside, her body was pounding, aching. I want to touch you, she said. He smiled down at her and pulled off his t-shirt. I was hoping you'd say that. She reached for him, unsure of what to do and how to do it. Be bold. Dear Barb, I only have time for a postcard. Sex was great. I was bold. And you were right. He knew what he was doing. Frankie became a new version of herself in Rye's bed. They spent their days and nights exploring each other's bodies, learning cues, and listening. She discovered a passion so deep it stripped away her shyness, dissolved the once important rules of propriety, redefined her. Her desire for him felt endless, boundless, desperate. Now they lay on a deserted beach beneath a cliff that had taken resolve to descend. The locals called it Secret Beach, and the name was Apartment. They were the only people on this stunning white sand beach. Waves crashed along the shore, made a roaring sound, while shorebirds wheeled overhead, white specks against the cloudless blue sky. The water looked too rough to swim in, so they just lay near it. They had fallen asleep in the shade for a while, holding hands, their bare feet touching. She already couldn't sleep without touching him. Frankie didn't know how long she'd been asleep, but when she woke, the sun was beginning to set. She rolled over, rested her chin on his chest. Rye kissed her, and they made love again, in the way that had already become familiar to Frankie, slowly at first, building desire to a fever pitch, and then in a pounding, gasping, shattering fury that left them both breathless and depleted. Afterward, she stared at him, unable to look away, still a little breathless. Sand speckled his tan cheeks, clung to his dark lashes. Every moment with him coalesced at once into this heaviness in her heart, and she realized suddenly, sharply, how much passion changed things. He could break her heart in ways she couldn't even imagine. Is this real, Rye? She asked. It happens so fast. I'm not experienced enough. I've never felt this way before, he said. Honest to God. You destroy me, Frankie. Thank God, Frankie said softly. True love. She hadn't known until now, this second, that she'd been waiting for it all her life, saving herself for it, believing in it even in the midst of war. On their last day on island, Frankie and Rye stayed in bed all day. When night finally began to fall, they showered and dressed for dinner and went to the restaurant, where they tried to keep up a steady stream of conversation, but time and again, each lapsed into silence. After dinner, they carried cocktails to the beach and sat down. A half-moon, draped in diaphanous gray clouds, shone silver light on the sand. A pale, foamy surf crashed up and back, whooshing toward them and retreating. I want to see you as much as I can before you go, Rye said. Go. She looked at him. You're going home in a few weeks, right? On Christmas Eve you told Coyote Herderos was in March. I knew we wouldn't have long together. I re-upped, she said. He drew back, let her go. What? You're not going home? The war is escalating, Frankie. The US can't admit it's losing, so it's going to get worse. I know all of that, Rye. It's why I re-upped. They need me.
No.
No. He actually looked angry. She loved him for worrying about her. That's not how this is going to work, Rye. Not how it is going to work.
Us.
I was raised to do as I was told, and it's bullshit. So, no telling each other what to do. Okay. He was clearly struggling with this. Can I say it scares me? Does it make me a chauvinist to want you to be safe? We'll be together. Together in Vietnam, he said harshly. It's hardly kawaii. Come on, Rye. This is who we are. We're believers, following our
Beliefs.
I believe in you, your duty, your honor. Do you believe in me? She saw how the question crumpled his resistance. Of course. Okay, then. We will be a great wartime love story, the pilot and the nurse holding hands while dodging bullets. You've seen too many movies?
Just tell me you love me.
We'll make it through and go home. Together. He stared at her, looking sad and afraid and proud, and still a little angry. There's no getting rid of me now, McGrath. I guess I'll have to re-up, too. I'm not leaving my girl over here without me.